Cemetery by Stephen Warrillow.
The morning was dull. The trees were barely moving in the breeze. It was cold, and though the sun had barely risen, it looked like it could be a nice day. The odd wood pigeon exploded out of one of the tall elms, as wood pigeons do, a strange affair that one. There were very large trees in the cemetery, planted around its perimeter. They were there long before the cemetery had arrived. The oldest grave had carved with the date 1697. He entered the cemetery through an iron gate. Beyond was a cobbled road that ran up to it. The road outside had terraced houses leading up to its gates. It was a steep climb to the cemetery. The church was at the bottom. Within the cemetery there was a good number of yew trees, which were of a great age. He liked cemeteries. Graveyards, call them what you will. He found them peaceful, unlike outside in the real world. He had found the place purely by accident. While at sitting on the top deck of a bus going into town, he had seen rows of gravestones between the trees. What struck him most was that they appeared untouched. All the local graveyards and churches were smashed and broken. This made him feel sad and angry. He walked up the first of many paths that intercrossed each other. The paths were well kept. The grass was mowed. Though it was too early for the cutting season to begin, he had worked as a gardener a good few years back. The paths were swept and there were no fallen leaves. This place was loved, cared for, and it felt calm. He loved reading gravestones and trying to imagine what the people had been like. As he walked, there was a slight breeze and the leaves rustled. Sometimes he thought he heard quiet murmurings. He also thought he heard some quiet giggling, but dismissed it. There was a school next door, and the other sounds were the hum of the traffic. He heard the murmurings again as he headed towards the top of the cemetery. A robin suddenly appeared, landing on top of one of the particular gravestone, and it sang its rather plain and sad winter song. It would not be long till it would be in full spring song, full of happiness and cheer. As he walked, he realised he was quite alone. He turned up a path to his right, where he spied a bench. He was feeling a little tired walking up the slope, so he decided to take a rest. He'd been sat there for a short while when he saw a couple walking up the hill towards him. They appeared to be elderly, and they walked slowly towards him. As they came closer, they talked together. As they passed, he said, "Good morning." They didn't answer, but carried on talking and walked on. He smiled to himself. In the old days, they would have said hello. Nowadays, nobody talks, he thought. He stood up and looked around the cemetery. In the middle was a small, handsome-looking church. He began to think it was a chapel of rest. Because of its size, it intrigued him. He heard a giggle again. Looking around, there was nobody there. He headed off down a thin path towards the chapel. As he arrived, he heard more murmurings, but again there was nobody about. As he walked towards the chapel, he noticed the door was locked with a very large and bulky lock. Strange, he thought. Was it there to keep somebody in or somebody out? As he walked past the chapel, the temperature began to fall, and in the trees the birds were silent. There was another giggle. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand, and he felt uncomfortable. He walked on hurriedly. As his discomfort settled, the temperature raised. A young boy suddenly ran past shouting. He said some pleasantry to the boy, but the boy ran on. He turned to see where the boy had gone, but the child was nowhere to be seen. He continued to explore some of the gravestones. There were newer gravestones. There were the fallen from the Great War and the Second World War. He stood for a moment and paid his respects. It was the old graves that fascinated him the most, especially the small ones, with just an initial or sometimes with nothing at all. He always looked over the walls at the end of the graveyards for those who weren't allowed to be buried in its sacred grounds. Where was the forgiveness in that? He had always thought. He approached a tiny grave. It looked like a child's. Once again, he heard a giggle. He looked over the cemetery, and there was nothing. As he walked, he felt an urge to go up to the chapel. The sun now risen. It was going to be a beautiful day, and though it was warming up, he still felt cold. As he walked, he looked at different gravestones and thought, if there is an afterlife, and you are buried here, would you get on with your neighbours? Would it be like the land of the living, where some neighbours you can get on with and others you don't? As the old saying went, you can't choose your family or your neighbours. The problem, he thought, is that in death you would have neighbours for eternity. He heard a murmur, but nothing was there. He suddenly found himself compelled to walk to the chapel. At first he rebelled, then he let himself be led. He walked towards the chapel. There was a feeling of excitement, but also a feeling of peacefulness. Another couple passed him, talking amongst themselves. Again, he was not noticed. He arrived at the chapel. As he got there, he approached one of the windows. He suddenly realised he couldn't see his reflection in the glass. This alarmed him highly. Then, looking into the gloom, he saw a coffin. It lay there alone, silent and peaceful. He watched it for several minutes, then turned. As he turned, a man walked by and said, "Good morning, beautiful day." He found himself replying, "Yes, yes it is." For some reason he felt happy and contented. He thought, "This has been a lovely morning. I think I'll nip to the cow for lunch." He walked down from the chapel and headed towards the iron gates from which he arrived. As he walked down, he saw a newly dug grave. He had a look at the gravestone. It read, Joseph James Turner, aged 26, tragically killed on the 1st of February 1926. 1900 to 1926. May he rest in peace. He stood and stared at the gravestone. Another boy passed him by and said, "Nice stone that is." He smiled, but he never made it to the cow for his lunch.